or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you so much for joining us for this final webinar in this particular series. Let me kick off by making the most important acknowledgement of the morning to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As everybody is well aware, we're in a context of a whole lot of racism, national and international protests, the destruction of some of our sacred sites. Our Indigenous people have a history of dispossession, massacres, stolen children, deaths in custody, and lots of levels of inequity. But let me also recognise the incredible leadership of our Indigenous people, their arts, their cultures, their dreaming, their languages, and the great contribution they make to our society. I want to acknowledge in particular that I'm on Dharawal country. They are traditional owners of this land. And let me pay my respects to the land that you're on, wherever you might be, and to elders past, present, and of course, emerging. And finally, I join the Uluru Statement's call for voice, treaty, truth. So today is our final webinar in the series. Many of you will be well familiar with our leaders, David Gonski and Peter Shergold, and that's, I'm sure, why you're here. So I'm not going to spend the next hour giving you their bios because I'm afraid it could take that long. But what I have decided to do is pull out a couple of things that these two incredible men have in common. They are both distinguished and publicly honoured leaders. They both hold ACs, the highest order of Australia. They both have reviews that have been famously named after them. They are both leaders of reviews, in particular in the education space, hence our topic. They're both chancellors, as Nicola noted, of two universities in New South Wales. They are innovators, they're generous with their time, they're strong supporters of people in general from all areas, including women, and spend a lot of time mentoring individuals. They've been involved in CSI since its inception and still are, and we're really grateful for their contribution. So please join me in welcoming David and Peter virtually to this seminar. We have just some of our closest friends with us. Around 600 people have registered for this webinar today. We're going to run a short Q&A with me, with David and Peter, and then we'll get to some of your questions. We only have an hour in total, so we won't get to everybody, but we'll do our best. So given the Centre for Social Impact, we're here to talk about the future of education, and we can't really focus on the future without first looking at where we are now. Because we do a lot of work around a fairer, more positive, more equitable future, I just wanted to make a couple of comments on educational inequity. It's pervasive, from early childhood through to higher education and beyond. We have people in particular groups who are constantly excluded: low SES, rural and regional, our Indigenous people, migrants and refugees, people with disability. But we know how much education matters. It matters economically, it improves people's quality of life, it supports social mobility, it reduces other public costs to society, and it's key to what people want and for the Australia that we all want to live in. We know there are a lot of amazing aspects to our education system at all levels, but we are struggling, and there are changes that need to be made both within educational institutions and outside of them to make education more equitable. So my first question to David, I might get you to kick off, is if you were to tackle this problem of educational inequity and you could change one thing inside a school gate or an education environment and one thing outside at any level, what would you pick?
Well, Kristy, firstly, thank you. And can I say it's a great honour to be on this webinar. I congratulate CSI on what they've achieved, and I must say it's very daunting, first, to have 600 people listening to this, and also daunting to be, so to speak, debating Peter Shergold, somebody I enormously respect and love working with. You've allowed me to only choose one within the gate and one outside the gate. And you're asking a person who wrote an entire review with my team, pointing out ideas and so on. So you've made it quite difficult for me, which you usually do, by the way. The idea I would put to you very strongly, which is really on the top of my mind, is that with COVID-19, obviously we've had to move towards remote learning. We've had to use the wonderful qualities of whether it's Zoom or any the equivalents, and the IT has been quite spectacular. But it has, in my opinion, highlighted potential evolvement of even more disadvantage. As I sit here comfortably in my study, I think about all those who've had to be taught remotely in places where they've had to share technology, where they may not have had good and quiet areas to work with. They may not have had instruction from teachers who've been given instruction on how to use remote learning, how to prepare lessons in the best way for those who may not be able to hear everything that's coming through or deal with it. So if you gave me only one in this time of COVID-19, I would say I really think we've got to put a lot of thought into how we teach remotely, how we prepare the lessons, how we transmit the lessons, how we make sure that with which it's received is actually taken. And by the way, I choose that as my one within the school gate, because from now on, the school gate is much more diverse than just the gate at the end of the school playground. On the question of outside of the gate, I have advocated for a long time of more involvement community-wise within the school to help disadvantage. I believe very strongly that we need some link with whether it be the local businesses or even the bigger businesses outside the school gate to help those who perhaps don't have those contacts, to help those who need some assistance from other areas, and to help those who may need mentorship and indeed some help in their learnings. So my second point, and the only other one you're allowing me, would be to be able to perhaps work more diligently to open up our thinking that schools need help, that they are, in my opinion, the fulcrum of a good community, and that the disadvantaged within there can prosper much better if the society around helps out.
Thanks, David. No challenge for you to top that. What would you pick, one within and one without?
Yeah, well, Kristy, I think I would cheat because I've got two examples, but in both related to what I think is important, which is bringing the inside and outside together in education. The first example I was going to use was the one that David has talked about so well, which is specifically COVID-19 related. The opportunity now to make remote learning, or better still, blended learning, part of what we do at secondary schools. You know, it's a normal part in most universities now, and some of the innovative TAFEs, far less so at the school level. And I think it is a way in which you can introduce students to a much bigger world of micro courses and micro credentialing, capture their passions and interests. But I share David's view. To do this, we've got to tackle the disadvantage that we have already seen exhibited in the last 8 to 10 weeks for some students in moving to remote learning. You know, the difficulty of having parents. If your parent's been relatively poorly educated and has low skills, much harder to support your child at home, where there isn't a quiet place to work, where you haven't got access to the technology. So I think this is a great opportunity, but we now have to think how we can tackle the digital tool divide disadvantage inherent in blended learning at schools. The second is a more general issue though. Let me do a bit of a teaser. Next week, the report that I have just finished chairing on senior secondary pathways will go to the Education Council, hopefully be released within a few weeks. But let me say, in chairing that review, it has become increasingly obvious to me that the way ATAR is presently used in schools is distorting, profoundly distorting the educational experience. This focus as judging someone on a single number, which is a number intended for ranking. I think we're the only country I've yet found in the world who brings it down to a single number. And the difficulty is that is distorting what happens in the final years of education at schools and is distorting choices. And one of the real problems we have in schools, incidentally, at the moment, is I think the level of pastoral care is much better than it used to be 10 years ago. The level of career guidance is much worse than it used to be 10 or 15 years ago. So you need that career guidance. But what you need is students know that if they want to pursue an academic pathway in senior secondary school and then into tertiary, that's fine. But don't do as we do now to make those who choose a trade approach or a school-based apprenticeship second best, because that's how most students see it. So what I would like to do is to now move to a higher school certificate, which still captures ATAR, which still captures, more importantly, your range of academic subjects, but also incorporates a learning profile, which includes not just what you have learned at school, but what you have learned outside of it, because that too is a way of tackling disadvantage. The person who is working shifts at McDonald's is learning a huge amount. The disadvantaged student who is having to care for their parents is learning a huge amount. The Aboriginal person in a remote community who goes and is doing a secret men's business is learning a huge amount. So what I would love to see is that range of learnings is incorporated in preparing a young person for the future, not just for the labour force, important though that is, but also for active citizenship. So what I hope we can do is have a quite different way of doing senior secondary pathways. And that, of course, is building on David's initial report.
Really important points by both of you. And I particularly like the piece around, you know, we can't just look at the outside the school gate and inside the school gate. We've got to bring the two pieces actually much better together. And we've seen how much disruption in COVID that the digital divide has caused. And we know that across the country, this has got around 2.5 million people who are digitally excluded. And so that's a really critical piece. And Peter, your point around active citizenship is quite interesting, because it is the piece that actually the Productivity Commission says needs to include as a outcome for students. So it fits very nicely. On those COVID disruptions that both of you have sort of started to mention, you know, we've obviously seen major disruption around people having to learn remotely, David, as you pointed out, and we've seen the digital divide. We've also seen some fundamental changes and positive policy come in around, you know, temporarily making childcare free for our essential workers, for example. So there's been a whole lot of disruption. We've seen big disruptions in the higher education sector around loss of international students. What do you think are some of the key lessons that we can take from the disruption that we have been through and are going through with COVID-19?
I've been thinking about this a lot. You'll remember that I wrote a report that was accepted in principle, which means very little has happened to it, on learning from failure for the Commonwealth Government. And that was about what went wrong, tragically wrong, with the rollout of the home insulation programme. Yeah. I suspect someone could be writing a report now along very similar lines about what's happened with robo-debt, you know, exactly how you can get it wrong, not just as policy, but in terms of how you can absolutely fail in terms of implementation. And my very strong view is you can only judge the quality of public policy by how well it's implemented. They're not two different things. And yet, against that, what we have seen is that at a moment of crisis, literally, you know, life and death crisis, you can move very fast, particularly in the public arena. I had seen it in my previous life on a small scale when we had the Asian tsunami, where suddenly, because of that crisis, you were able to get people to work together across jurisdictions, across sectors in a collaborative way. And I think, you know, I can think of many specific failures you can attribute to governments in terms of COVID-19 in Australia. But overall, it's been a much more successful approach, I think, through, you know, using national cabinet and getting people to talk. What I have learned from this is if there is a will, it is possible to move profoundly, pretty quickly, in the same sort of way that we should with other public policy. In other words, listen to experts, first of all. You know, if you're going to move quickly, get the best expert advice that you can. Appreciate the public sector we have in Australia. I mean, we can argue about, you know, what should be the level of New Start payments, etc., etc. But compared with many countries around the world, I think it would be difficult for most Australians not to realise how lucky we are that we have a pretty good safety net and we have a pretty good public health system. And that has helped us enormously. But that we can move quickly, but we need to do so in an adaptive way. We will get some things wrong, and we have, but one of the good things is we've been willing, if you like, to fail quickly and move and change. All of this sort of much more adaptive approach to governance, or almost experimental, we have seen at work in response to COVID-19. And you think, oh, when we go to the new normal, will part of that new normal just be reverting to the previous way that we did governance? Or is this an opportunity to learn from this and have more collaborative approaches, more human-centered design, engaging citizens, and creating political narratives that take people with you? I'd love to think that is the case, and being a sort of half glass full, I am relatively hopeful that we may be able to at least pick some of this up and take into the future with us.
Thanks, Peter. David, do you want to fill up the rest of the glass, or do you want to drain it?
Well, firstly, can I say I'll start by filling the rest of it. I mean, I agree with Peter in many respects. I mean, actually, I think people talk about the disruption of COVID-19, and it has been enormous. But I think as Australians, we can be quite proud of a lot that's happened. I mean, obviously, my fingers are crossed and everything else is crossed that we don't have reinfection, that we don't have a recurrence. But to date, I think the government response has been first rate. I think, as Peter said, the way people have worked together has been not only commendable, but almost amazing. And I think very, very wonderful in this country, and we can be very proud. You actually asked the question, though, because you always ask a very strong question. You're talking about perhaps what's happened to universities in terms of our foreign students not being able to be with us. And it's quite interesting. What have we learned from that? Well, I think the first thing I would say, and this is not typical of universities, this is typical generally in Australia, that perhaps our long-term planning has not been quite as good as it should be. We are not great long-term thinkers in this country. I'm not advocating that we should go for 5-year plans as other countries do, but I do think in the work I've done in my life, I've seen, for example, in Singapore and in Europe, much longer thinking than we do here. It is popular thinking that, you know, the universities, many of them, took too many overseas students and now they're paying the price. That's not quite true at all, in my opinion. And for people to think that universities didn't put aside some money just in case there was a downturn is also, in my opinion, you know, making trouble for universities. Universities did do that, and certainly mine did, and I'm sure Peter's did. But what we didn't do is to really look at what a real catastrophe could be. We looked at the mobility, of some countries not being able to get here, of people because of changes in values of currencies not being able to afford to come, and so on. And we allowed for that. But this was a major, major disruption. And I think now, if I look back, I think long-term planning in the university sector, maybe generally in education, needs to be thought through. And I think that's the lesson from the disruption. But I do not want anyone to feel, which is, I know quite a lot of people talking about, that universities weren't aware that basically their model was based on these students for their research, and indeed didn't put aside monies just in case. They did that, and now, of course, this is a bigger problem, and they will deal with it accordingly.
Mm. It's a really interesting lesson around what planning for what a real catastrophe might look like, and I think that would be a fair lesson for a whole lot of industries, David. I don't know how many people actually predicted that we'd ever be in this kind of situation, and I think one of the points I probably would reinforce from Peter, your notes, is how agile and quickly everybody has responded to this. It's been really quite remarkable. Do you think that there are different lessons that we should take for different levels in the education system? And what might this mean for, say, vocational education compared to higher education or school students?
Is that a question for Peter or David, or for the general?
Well, I just threw it out there. I didn't want to throw either of you under the bus specifically, so I just thought one of you might want to pick it up. But so either of you are welcome.
Well, let me have a crack at that, because just as I responded negatively to the idea of inside outside, I tend to have that with education generally, these sort of bifurcations that you were suggesting. I mean, if I'm reshaping the future of education, one of my starting position is, I think, that too much of our education has been distorted by unrealistic and unnecessary bifurcations between university teaching and research, between scholarship and training, between higher education and vocational education. That to me is not the world of the future. We know that young people, particularly once they leave school, are in a world where they actually start to put together their own educational passports. We know that some move from vocational education to higher and vice versa. Increasingly, at least with my students, they're doing it the same. Increasingly, they're also wanting to take on micro credentialing that's available on the outside, not just in Australia, but from around the world, some of which is produced by universities, some by industry. So I suppose if I'm looking for the future, I'd like to give some real substance to what's become a sort of a well-worn cliche about lifelong learning. My view is that education really is still the cornerstone of a fair go Australia. It is the cornerstone of equal opportunity and equity. But for it to be that, we need to be serious about what we are teaching people for from school and then after school, is that capacity and interest in continuing to learn through all their whole lives. For me, I don't care whether they've actually done plumbing or history or law, except that out of that, you want someone who wants to continue and is able to keep learning throughout their lives, because that's what people are going to need. We know they're going to need it for the future workforce, which is going to be disrupted by cognitive technology and robotics. We know they're going to need it, though, for active citizenship. And I think probably all of us on this webinar know it's also something you need for its intrinsic enjoyment. The fact that you can continue to research and keep on learning about various things, it actually makes for a more fulfilling life. So let's try and get back to education, forget these at the start at least, forget these bifurcations and think what we want is to train people who have an interest and ability to keep on learning through their lives.
And can I add, I mean, Peter there has covered so many things. I'd just like to draw out a couple of things that he's actually covered and endorse. Well, I endorse all that he said, but the first thing I would say is with COVID-19 and this enormous effect it's had on us, it underlines the importance of education. We start with that. Education is something you can take with you, and education should be a much better way of being able to appreciate the cards that are being dealt as you go along. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, by definition, as Peter so eloquently says, that means you need continuing education. Because in life, basically nothing stands still, as we've just seen it. And when disasters occur, and they will sadly, one's got to be able to work out what is best for oneself and indeed one's community. And education plays an enormous role there in re-equipping one, in bringing one's thinking to the fore, and indeed assuring one sometimes that one's own thinking is correct. And finally, Peter makes the point about, I call it continuum, that the concept of the separate education pieces, I agree with him absolutely, is wrong. And I want to pick up something he said earlier. He talked about the difference between skills and education at university and how one's often loved and the other not as loved as it should be. I think we have to realize that the world deals these different cards, and different skills, different education will be needed as we go along. And we may come in and out of these different paths, but also the people who've got it may become more or less important as we go forward. And finally, because I want to get that glass full, by the way, Kristy, I actually think it's terribly exciting what's going forward, terribly exciting, in the sense that we shouldn't fear AI, all of the new technologies. We should learn to work with them, getting AI to do all those horrible things I hate doing, like all the mundane duties, and rising above it to be able to do the things that humans do best.
Thank you for filling up the glass. And I particularly like, two quotes. I'm going to pull out two things. Peter, your piece around education is the cornerstone of a fair Australia, and David, your piece around the fact that we need continuing education, because the notion of both of those things mean that we can continue to make it fairer as we go along if we make education more available, more accessible, and we do this in a continuous way. And David, I love the humility in continuing education, because we can't ever know enough, and always having that question of what else can I learn is actually really quite fabulous. I'm conscious of us promising that we would leave a whole lot of time for Q&A. So I might just talk to start asking some of those questions. We've had a lot on the feed. And then if you've got additional things to add around that future of education and how you'd want to revision it, please do so. I'm just going to run through a couple of random questions, and then we'll start to sort through which ones we might pick. But there's been a question here from Mitch that asks, do you think that those at the top with privilege should move out of the way to make room for more diverse leaders? And you can answer that in the context of an education setting.
So let me start with that. I don't know about moving out of the way. They should certainly widen up. There is no doubt, in my view, of the value of diversity in leadership. Because if you work with if, as I do, you actually believe in teamwork and collaboration, that you actually get benefits from that. It is also true from my experience that if you've got a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of experiences and views of the world, you get much better decisions being made, whether it's at universities or in business or in government. So yes to that diversity. What I would like to do is to see education as a way in which we can start, as I hope we do with migrants, to actually understand that disadvantage should not just, I emphasize, just be seen through a social deprivation lens. In my view, disadvantage can also be something that increases our productive diversity. You know, someone who has come from overseas, for example, and is having to learn new language, new culture. Yes, those are problems and barriers, but what they bring Australian in terms of cultural understanding and other language skills and risk-taking entrepreneurship adds to what we've got. My view, going back to what I was saying about schools, is the same. I'm sure many people just go and, work at their local cafes. Hopefully we'll soon be able to go back to their local cafes to work, or McDonald's, because it brings in income. But we know, in fact, there is a huge amount of learning that takes place there. Now, my hope is that, in fact, some of the learning you have to overcome barriers, Aboriginal people, low-income people, people in remote and rural areas of Australia, those barriers, and in fact, can be a really important part of learning, and we need to recognise that and value that. If we're looking about risk-taking, if we're looking about complex problem solving, if we're looking about collaboration, all of these important skills for the future, we can see that some of what you face through this variety of disadvantages can give you learning experiences. Our problem at the moment is we do not sufficiently recognise that or even celebrate it in the way we look at education.
And I would add to that, Kristy, if I may, I totally agree with the concept of diversity, and Peter's articulated that beautifully. But there is another point, I think, in the questioner's comment. They're talking about perhaps those with privilege who are in positions should move out of the way. I actually think a good manager, a good leader, sees as one of their most important roles that of nurturing those who are coming behind them. And often it's forgotten, and it shouldn't be. And often it's not seen as great leadership potential, and it shouldn't be. So my answer to the question would be, Peter's point's right. We need both. We need those who are disadvantaged to rise to wonderful positions, and those who are privileged not to be disadvantaged because they are privileged. But those who are there now must nurture those who are coming behind them. Mentorship, teaching, etc. These are the things that I believe we should be doing, and that will level the playing field a bit more and also get the best leaders for the future.
Thanks, David. I'm going to just ask you to answer another question while I've still got you talking and online. So Anne has picked up some of your points around the long-term planning and long-term thinking. And David, I know you're a bit of an expert at, bipartisan balancing. So Anne's question is around so I'm just going to read this for you. Long-term thinking has been a real frustration for education and training policymakers. Should we be encouraging political parties to take a non-partisan lens to key portfolios such as education, social support and health?
Yeah, this question has been asked of me before. It's a very good question. Firstly, I actually do believe in democracy. And just to rephrase, the question I often get is, yeah, this long-term thing, that's great. And it's great if you're a dictator. But in a democratic system, you spend so much time dealing with the here and now that you don't actually, manage to do long-term thinking. And you've got 3-year governmental terms as well. But I actually believe that in democracy, and I believe that what we need to do, and by the way, COVID-19 might be a wonderful lesson for that. We've got to elevate our thinking, that we don't just take the cheap shots. we don't just try and destabilize things, but that both sides of the house, or any side of the house, takes big visions and starts to encourage each other to look for a long-term vision, question it, and try and hone it for the benefit of all. And by the way, education is no different to any other portfolio or any other thinking. This applies to them all.
I think that's important. Peter, are you still with us? I can't see you on the video. Not sure if he's dropped off. We might, I might have to continue with David for the moment, but Peter, I'm sure, will join us back in a second. He might be having internet issues. David, there's a question here about, we're going into obviously an economic downturn and we don't know what that will look like globally, and it creates a whole lot of uncertainty for the future. How do you think educational institutions should be preparing our young people? You mentioned AI before. I've heard you talk before about the future of work. What role do you think educational institutions should be playing at the secondary level and the tertiary level, to deal with that?
Well, can I firstly say that, yes, we don't know what the economic future is, but can I also say to you, you never know that. I'm an absolute expert on what happened yesterday, but I find it very hard to predict always what's going to happen tomorrow. But the thing that can help you handle that is education, because education can teach you what happened in the past, the lessons you can learn from that, and also prepare the way of thinking to deal with whatever comes at you in the future. Risk planning, or for that matter, being a pioneer in a particularly new industry. So I start with that proposition. The second thing I would say is I'm a great believer in teaching people to think outside the box. There are many, magnificent educational terms for it. And obviously in the second of the reports that I was lucky enough to chair, we deal with that extensively. I really do believe that people should be thinking to solve problems, thinking to think outside of what basically is the rote learning, etc. And by the way, some people say it's STEM, some people put STEAM in the STEM, the extra A, because they see, as I do often, that arts is a wonderful way of honing one's thinking. But having said that, the essence is, the wonderful thing about the human mind is that it doesn't just take A and go to B. It can be creative. It can be reflective. It can be emotional. It can be compassionate. And I believe these are all the things we've got to hone in our education system. And come AI, I'm not a great technologist, but it's going to be a long time, if ever, that you can create a box that can do all that the human mind can do. I mean, I believe you can get a robot that will hold your hand, but thinking when you're in trouble, when somebody puts their hand there and says, I'm here for you, that's a human concept, that's a caring one, and that's what we can do.
Wendy from the Smith family is talking about the discussions that have been had, and you sort of referred to this as well, David, around COVID and the increasing inequity that we might be seeing amongst our disadvantaged children from whatever backgrounds they might be from and our more advantaged ones. How confident are you that we could start to close some of that learning gap in future years? And what advice would you have for education leaders and policymakers who are trying to do that?
Well, can I firstly say, it was 2010/11 that we wrote the first of the two reports I've been involved in, and we saw the problem then. And I might say the Smith family have played a fantastic part in alerting people to that problem, and also with their various programs helping in it, as have many others. There is a gap, and I think there are a number of ways of assisting in that. My first report was designed to provide the money. I felt very, very strongly that the people who were dealing with the problem, namely the teachers, the principals of the schools, and those who were dealing with the combined set of schools, were the people to make the decision how that money should be used. And I know over time, there have been many who said it could have been done a different way, but I think that is the way to do it. I think that we have now, with the remote learning possibility and the use of technologies, a fantastic opportunity to assist in leveling the playground, if I may call it that, or the ground below us. And I think together with the additional funding that's now coming through, we should really focus on that. I'm not giving Peter's coming, he's pulled the curtain apart, but I'm not giving a total reassurance that we can achieve that. But I'm very confident that with the thinking that's going on around Australia, that we can take big steps towards it and ultimately get there.
Thanks, David. I like your confidence, and I'm hopeful with you. Peter, while you've been away, we've been solving...
On the phone, my internet went down.
It's okay. We understand these things happen. That damn digital divide problem that we have. Look, there's been quite a few questions that have come in that are relevant for you. I won't go over what we've just been talking about. One of the ones, Peter, I wanted you to specifically pick up, there's been a few comments and questions around your learning continuum. And can you explain that a little bit more and what that looks like? And then the second thing is, I'd really love you and then David to have a comment on the paradigm shift that we might need to see if we're going to more value different forms of education. So, you know, higher education versus vocational education and training, and how we land in that shift.
Okay, so to start from the second, one of the challenges we have is that in too many schools, not all, but in too many schools, students at around 15, 16 are sort of being told almost they have to make a decision about their future. Are you going to go an academic route and aspire to university, or are you going to do vocational education? And it's a quite unnecessary choice to be able to have, because what we need to say, if you decide you want to do trade skills, there are all sorts of openings ahead of you, both setting up your own business or at a later date, then deciding you want to go and do a degree. So that there's all sorts of choices people can make as long as they have learned and been taught and learned how to learn. On the first question, you know, if you think about it, what we are assessing when we look at the scores which students get, which then become an ATAR at senior secondary school, is in a sense not scores of how much history do you know or how much maths do you know. Again, it is about what you have learned from learning history or learning math. There are these capabilities that you have acquired. Now, the difficulty is those capabilities are tending to get lost. And yet we know the sort of capabilities, the life skills, the work skills, broadly, that you need for the future. And it's, in a sense, not to do with math or history. It's, can you solve complex problems? Can you work as a part of a team? Have you got the self-discipline to work on your own behalf? So what I would really like to do is, for when students leave school, whenever they leave school and what choices they make at that time, knowing they can change, that they have a learner profile which they have helped to assess and their teachers have helped them to assess about what are these capabilities, these skills, these attributes that they have acquired going into adulthood, to have, you know, a learner profile that sets that out. And indeed, what I'd like to go further is then that learner profile becomes the framework for an education passport that you then take with you through your life. And whether you're doing a degree or a diploma or vocational education or a micro-credentialing or work-based experience, through your life, you continue to add that to your education passport. And that, of course, helps to convey culturally that education is going to be a part of your life. You know, one of the jobs I do, Kristy, as you know, is chairing residential aged care homes. What is clear to me there is, you know, even people with modest dementia, and certainly those who are physically fragile in their 80s, you know, if they've got the experience, and many do have, to keep learning a bit of a language or do things in music or learn to use an iPad, how much better off they are in their 80s. That learning, ability to learn, is still a key part of their lives.
And Kristy, I would add, I mean, one of the things your question was asking, and I agree with what Peter said, but one of the questions you were asking is, you know, in looking to the future, is there some sort of structural change and so on? One of the things I've found in Australia during my life is we do see differences between people, even though we're quite egalitarian compared to many parts of the world. Throughout my life, there have been very few people that I've seen, and by the way, Peter is one of them, who've moved from academic life into public life, government, and then into business. Generally, business is suspicious of academics. They, you know, don't do things, as you know, Kristy. Academics think business people are only driven by profit, and probably government don't think much of either of them. The reality is they're all people, and they're all needed at particular parts of the continuum. And if we can work together, as you raised earlier, all the better. It's the same, in my opinion, with our obsession that if you don't go to university, somehow you haven't achieved, you know, the pinnacle. It's quite wrong. And I always talk about the situation when you have a plumbing problem at home. A hydraulic engineer from any university, Peter's or mine, is useless. You need a plumber. The hero of the piece is the plumber, and that is life. And we have to acknowledge that a great, skilled person may well be greater than anybody who's gone through university and hasn't been a great academic. And we should be looking at the merit of what people do, not the sector in which they do it. Once we change that, that will have a flow on right through education.
I love that because it taps into, I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. It taps into the cultural piece that's so important as part of this, as well as how we might think about it structurally into the future. And that whole notion of how we might, how we think about everybody is just people, I think showed up a lot in COVID, and that piece around how we actually value people. And I've heard you talk about this before, David, how we value people for their contribution to the world, not, you know, whatever they're being paid. And that there can be a, I'm trying to remember the words you used, David, they were fabulous, you can remind me. But that piece around, you know, in COVID, we actually, the public culture shifted to sort of really value our teachers, our care workers, our hospital workers, the people who picked up our rubbish, all of those roles in society that are just so critical. And you had a really nice phrase that I've heard you use before, the Gonstead Pendulum, I think. Yeah. Is that it? Can you tell us about that?
You're the second person to refer to that. Only me, the Gonski, has ever mentioned it before. So it obviously isn't a great moment. But I do believe there is a pendulum that basically on the one end is high pay and on the other end is high acknowledgement and importance of your job. And often you'll see that people who are incredibly well paid actually are well paid for something that doesn't have enormous social consequence. And in life you have to choose often what moves you. Do you move towards the money or the thing? And obviously everybody should be well paid for what they do. But I do believe in a free economy. Some will be paid more, but some may not get the accolades for that because maybe it's not as respected. It's a choice that you should be entitled to make. And I might say a choice that education can help you make.
Still holding the people at the core, Peter, I want to pick up something you mentioned earlier in a question that's emerged around active citizenship. And also, you know, one of the lessons that you pulled out, Peter, was around almost, you didn't say this, I'm not putting words in your mouth, redistribution of power, or how we do human-centered design. And so one of the questions that's come up around that is, how do we foster a greater culture of power sharing in school leadership and schools more generally, so children and young people can have more opportunities to engage in authentic participatory design with adults in positions of power?
Okay, let me take the two parts. First of all, active citizenship, on which I feel very strongly. You know, I am very persuaded by arguments put, for example, by the BCA, Business Council of Australia, that we have got to involve industry more in education, both at the school and the university level, and we need to prepare people for a future working life where, frankly, work is uncertain. Absolutely. But I don't believe that's the only instrumentalist purpose of education. I think equally important and equally challenging for Australia in this next 20 years is active citizenship. You know, when one watches the, you know, the emergence of sort of techno-authoritarian states now, one of the things that is worrying to me is the declining faith in Australia in processes of democratic governance. You know, it's too slow, it's too cumbersome, you can't get things done, and a disrespect for expertise and for, I think, the public arena generally. I think we have to take a big step forward here. We have thought of Australia in terms of representative democracy. What I think we've got to go to, and it gets to the second part of your question, is a much greater focus on participatory democracy. We've got to restore faith in democratic processes of governing ourselves. And I think that means both at school and in adulthood, we've got to give young people and then citizens much greater opportunity to be involved in the design of policy, and certainly the design of the delivery of policy. You know, and you get different perspectives. As you know, I work with refugees. I've worked with a group of really impressive young refugees last year. And working with them gave me a completely different way of seeing a public policy problem by involving them in the co-design. Because what they were telling me, though it took me time to hear it, was, look, the trouble is we go to government now as young people, they either give us a service provider, which will, this is how you get your Centrelink payment, or this is how you get this government program, or they give us a case manager, and the case manager ends up taking over our lives. We don't actually want either of those things. What we want is a navigator. We are young, we don't know Australia, we need to know our way around. We need someone who can help navigate us through and allow us to then take our own responsibilities. Now, that to me was a way of seeing the value of getting people involved, you know, from their own experience and helping to design policy much better. That's why I think you could do that at schools as well. Involve students and, of course, their parents, because it is their parents. Interestingly, rather than their peers, their parents are the most influential in helping to make decisions about the future. Involve students and parents in the design of what happens at schools.
Kristy, can I just very quickly just say, I think mentorship also is very important. I agree with what Peter said, but breaking down that gate at the end of the school there, however you do it, electronically or otherwise, and allowing students to have other ways of thinking and people they can talk to, as well as the endorsing Peter's ideas, I think it's a very good way of getting to where you want it to be.
Great, thank you. We've got literally 2 minutes left, and then the webinar will be ending. I do want to get to one really important question. It's probably, and there are many questions, we just couldn't get through anywhere near half of them. But there is a question here. We know in the papers around the difficulty that Australian universities are in. We have 40 in Australia. There's been things in the papers on 7:30 report, etc., about the financial implications of our institutions. There's a question here about, in a world of online learning, and given the context that we're now in financially with our Australian universities, what would differentiate Australian institution from the Harvards and the Stanfords? Can you answer that in 60 seconds? Tough one.
Yeah, well, I'll have a go at that. I think, firstly, I'd be very sad if all Australian institutions just educated remotely. I think bringing people together is very important. And bringing people together in Australia is something Harvard has great difficulties doing. They can try, but we as Australian universities can uniquely do that. And I think our way of thinking, I think our openness to ideas, and I think absolutely the traditions of our universities to date give us a great leg up in this regard. I'm happy to take on Harvard anytime, and although we've got financial difficulties now, watch this space.
I'm happy to take on Harvard too, but probably not on their terms. I mean, I think the key here is that each university should have its own mission and vision of what it seeks to do and what it seeks to be judged by. For my university at Western Sydney University, it is of being an open university, high proportion of low SES students as an anchor institution in Western Sydney. And yes, of course, the Times higher education ratings are important. But for me and for my university to come in number 3 in the world on the UN sustainability ratings is as important to me on how Harvard is judged, because that, in a sense, is the particular distinctive mission. And I suspect each university going forward in Australia will start to develop its own particular strengths, which it will take forward.
Look, thank you to you both for a really fascinating discussion. Thank you for being so wonderful and inspiring and glass half full people. I think, you know, you have helped to paint a vision where we may one day decrease, hopefully, educational inequity and have a future that individuals carry along their education passports to all sorts of different places. And we have a distinctiveness and a great Australia where we can all learn and benefit from. CSI will do more in this space into the future. I'm going to let Nicola sign off, but please join me in collectively thanking two wonderful men, David Gonski and Peter Shergold.
Thanks so much, Kristy, and thank you so much, David and Peter. A great discussion, and what a way to end Impact 2020. Thanks everybody for your time today. We will be in touch after this webinar with links to the recording and so on, and this will not be the last you will hear from us in the webinar space. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.